What we're going to do is talk about vintage. It's titled Vintage Beer, but this is about aging and cellaring beer. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is, not a lot of people know this, but just like wine, beer can actually improve with age, but it's only certain styles. Just like wine, only certain styles. So, but the key to anything when you talk about beer or wine, the first step is understanding your palate and your personal preferences. Don't let anybody tell you what's good or what is bad, what you like. Your palate will tell you that. And just like anything else, as we get older or as circumstances change, so does our palate. Our palates can actually change. So before you start jumping into aging and cellaring beers, first you got to decide, what are you trying to accomplish by aging or cellaring a beer, right? Until you have a goal, your goal is to define your goal, right? So could be better, could be worse, right? So today we're going to talk about why we age beer, what to age, how to age it, and then we'll also talk at the end a little bit about design considerations for when you're brewing a beer, if you want to have a beer that you want to age, okay? So first step is, okay, well, why would you want to cellar or age a beer, okay? Let's start off with a category that gets overlooked a lot. So first of all, breweries brew their beers to be consumed fresh, okay? Even an aged beer. There's some breweries that will brew barrel-aged barley wines, or they brew it so that when you buy it or you come here, it's exactly the way the brewer intended it to taste, okay? So on tap right now, they have barrel-aged Sorrow. It was barrel-aged in maple barrels for 2 years. And the head brewer at Ocelot, Jack, he tasted it every few weeks to make sure that it was exactly what he wanted to do. And then he canned it and he served it, right? So that's what you're tasting. Now, could you age that beer? Absolutely, you probably could. But guess what? It's going to change and it's not going to be exactly what. So keep that in mind when you age beers, unless it specifically says a beer will improve with age, like Dogfish 120, which is a common beer that a lot of folks age. Does it age well? We'll let you guys decide. But I'm gonna contrast that with a beer that I found in my fridge from 2019, brewed by Ocelot, called Talking Backwards. Okay, this violates a lot of the aging rules because this is a highly hopped beer. It's a triple IPA, but it also has a high alcohol content. It's similar to what you would consider in Dogfish 120, which is really borderline triple IPA and American barley wine. Both very heavily hopped, okay? So as we drink these, we'll talk a little bit about. So just go ahead and pass these around. Take a small amount because we've got a lot of beer to drink tonight. Just take a small amount. The 120 is in the bottle. Oh, this is from 2016. This is a 2016. Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk about verticals. We'll get to verticals, guys. We'll get to verticals. So there's a few different there's a few different types of aging. So first, there's a lot of beers that you don't want to age because they're just not designed to age. Hoppy beers you want to drink fresh, right? They're designed IPAs, double IPAs. Those are designed to drink fresh. Okay? Brewers design those to drink fresh. Wits, some of the lighter beers, lagers, etc. Go ahead and pass that. There's also short-term aging. Short-term aging is like a couple weeks or a couple months or whatever. So if you're like stocking up for a party, or it's beers that can actually survive and not degrade with a couple of weeks worth of aging, right? So an IPA, you want to drink it fresh, right? The longer an IPA sits on your shelf, the more it degrades. But things like porters and stouts and ambers and even some of the lagers, they can sit for a few weeks and they'll still be fine, okay? And then, like, the real core topic of this discussion tonight is we're going to be talking about beers for long-term aging, okay? And what I'm talking about is we're talking months years and even longer. Okay, there are beers that actually stand up to this. So let's just make sure we're clear about a couple of things, right? Because every once in a while we have a beer that sits in our keg for a long time and it doesn't taste bad, right? Sometimes we get lucky. It's just like sour beers, okay? Or putting it in adjuncts, like if you take a stout and you put coconut in it or something like that. You can't take a bad beer and make it better with putting in microbes or putting in adjuncts or putting in anything. You're just basically covering it up, right? Aging is not going to make a really bad beer better, okay? Let's start off with that. So, and I also put in a list, and I can distribute this afterwards. There are a few local, not too good, huh? Which one's causing that face?
4 years. Talking backwards, definitely. This is a little bit old too. A little stringent.
The 120 is very boozy.
Yeah, 120 is boozy, and yeah. So we'll get to some of that stuff. But local beers that actually have cellars, there's actually a few places here locally that have good beer cellars. There's probably more, so you guys can tell me, but the Sovereign down in Georgetown, they have a beer cellar. You have to ask for the cellar list. They've got beers that are aged as old as 2010, right? You just have to ask for the cellar list and they'll get you a beer when you're having a meal there or what have you, right? The same thing with the Church Key. They have a big, huge beer list. If you ask for the cellar list, totally different menu. A lot of different stuff on there. A lot of interesting stuff, a lot of stuff that's been aged, and amazing stuff, right? And then there's a place up in Philly called the Monk's Cafe. You're familiar with the Monk's Cafe, right? So there's a lot of resources there. So what are some of the styles that tend to age really well? Oops. Sorry. What are some of the styles that tend to age really well? Barley wines, anything with alcohol above 7%. You don't want to age anything that's lower than 7% because alcohol acts as a preservative. Okay. Smoke beers, American sours and Brett beers, because one of the things about those is they'll evolve over time. The yeast character will continue to evolve and the beer will continue to evolve. Imperial stouts, barrel-aged beers, Scotch, winter ales, and then really interesting is the bottle-conditioned beers actually tend to really develop over time because there's still yeast, there's still activity going on in the bottle.
Would some porters fall into the stout?
Yeah, imperial porters, yeah, that kind of falls into the dark beer category of stouts, right? Imperials, barrel-aged, etc. But a key, that barrier, you want to make sure it's over 7%. That's really the Mendoza line when it comes to aging beers. If you anything lower than that, you're risking it degrading, it spoiling, it getting some weird off flavors.
A lot of people say like a Berliner, even though it's a low ABV, they say it really matures.
That sits in the sours category. So yeah, if it has the acid in there, even though it's lower, so you can some of the sour beers you can actually really play around with. But I wouldn't do a Berliner Weiss for like more than a couple of years. Like if you go into like 5, 6, it's going to get really funky and weird. Okay? So now let's talk about how we age in cellar beers. Okay? This is very important. There's a couple of things that we need to be mindful of. One, first of all, is you want to store the beer upright. Why would you say you want to store the beer upright? As opposed to like when you age wine, you store it on the side. Why would you think you want to age the beer upright?
To get the floaties to the bottom.
Well, the yeast and the sediment is going to fall to the bottom.
That's part of it. Yeah, some of the proteins and particulates can fall out of solution. What else? What's that? Could be. So when you lay it on its side, you're basically elongating whatever dissolved oxygen is in the bottle, so you have more surface area, so it actually exposes it to more oxygen. And it depends on if it's a cap or if it's a cork or what type of bottle, but with beer as opposed to wine you want a little bit of that happening. Beer, you don't want that. You want to make sure, so limiting the oxygen exposure is critical. So store it straight up and down. And the yeast, depending on the bottle conditioning status, you want to have that sediment down. You don't want it to get cloudy. You don't want a bunch of weird stuff going. And re-fermentation.
So the wine is to keep the cork moist so it doesn't contract.
Exactly. So yeah, you don't want the cork to dry out, which is also important in some beers if you have a cork. But so dark beer, I mean, a dark area. You don't want light. You don't want sun. It's just like when you're fermenting your beer. You don't want to expose it to UV light or a lot of light sources, right?
So if you had a dark beer, would you on the side keep it for wet?
Nope. Nope. So cool and stable temperatures. So we find that the 50 to 55 degrees is a sweet spot for ales, but you got to be careful because lagers, if you're going to age a lager like an imperial, like a Baltic porter, right? That's a tricky one because at 50 degrees, that could trigger re-fermentation if there's still yeast in suspension because that yeast, so the reason that 50 to 55 degrees is to keep it from initiating a fermentation and a really strong active fermentation. It'll slow that down. So if you have lagers that you want to do like a Baltic porter, you're going to want to even go a little bit colder, okay? Humidity controlled, and this gets back to the cork thing because the corks can dry out, but the interesting thing about a cork bottle is if it's too humid, you can also get some mold and some bacterial growth on the cork. Not necessarily going to get into the beer, but I don't know if you've ever seen a cork that's got mildew on it. Yeah, get rid of it. It's not good. I don't care what liquid in the bottle is. So, and then you have to really understand like what you're going to use for that controlled environment, right? So, I have a basement. I stick it in the basement. It doesn't get a lot of moisture there. It's actually a fan-controlled room environment. I got a basement bathroom. It stays really cool in there, right? Some people use like a wine fridge or a temperature-controlled fridge. Other people just have like a closet, like in this picture. This is a really good, except for that big, bright, like ridiculous light in there. This is a really good way to store your beer, upright in shelving in a temperature-controlled. The key thing about temperature is you don't necessarily have to hit that 50 to 55 degree range, but make sure it's stable. If you have a fluctuation in temperature, just like when you're fermenting beer, that fluctuation in temperature is going to cause shock to the beer, and it's going to age more quickly. It's going to throw off some weird flavors. It's not going to age gracefully, okay?
So does that shock affect beer the longer it sits? Because, I mean, beer distributors, right, they're shocking beer all the time.
Yep.
Right, so your fresh beer, it's going from fridge to truck, fridge to truck, to fridge to truck.
Yep.
Over the course of a couple of months or a couple of weeks, not killing it, right? But over the course of a couple of years, it has more impact.
Yeah, I mean, the more you do it, like, so.
So let's say I'm aging beer, right? And I shock it the first 3 weeks, but then I age it for a year or 2 years. Does that stable it out after those 2 years?
Yeah, that's part of the aging process. So like we'll get to like what happens during aging. I think that's probably a better way to address that question. And the key is like that requires more experimentation, I would say, and it's a good experiment to run because there's really not a lot of scientific studies that have been done about aging beer, just like wine. I mean, there's some wines that do improve over time. There's some that go bad in, a year or two, right? So it's interesting. So that would be really interesting. It also makes a really good argument to if you're going to age beer, buy local. Don't buy stuff that's gone out on distribution that is, been shocked through. Yeah, trucking and distribution. Yeah, I'm not going to exclude that, but you're going to be subject to whatever that distribution impact, especially if you're buying beers that were brewed in the spring and then distributed in the summer. They could have been exposed to all different types of temperature, climate, and et cetera. So, and this gets back into a little bit of what you're talking about too, Phil, is like, how long do I age it? Well, it's really not very scientific, right? It's certain styles will age better. It's doing a lot of research on your own. But what I recommend if you want to start aging beer is buy a few of the same beer, right? Buy 3 to 6 bottles of the same beer and age it over time and see how it does, see how it improves. Taste it after a year, taste it after 18 months, and see how it improves. And you're going to find, and this is the same with wine, is you're going to find that there's a sweet spot. Now you can do research and say, yeah, this one does really good at 5 or 6 years, but when you hit that sweet spot, you got to be careful because then it can also go into the it's past its prime range, and then when it gets past its prime, then it's not that great. And
I buy 120 when Costco gets it every time Costco gets it.
Yep.
And I buy like 2 4-packs if my wife's with me, or 4 4-packs if she's not.
Yeah.
And,
It's on camera.
yeah. But 4 years for me is a sweet spot. And so I buy it with the intention, and I figured out 4 years because I would buy a bunch, and then I would do several verticals and figure out, like, all right, I got something 6, 7 years old, and 5. We had one night where we did fresh through 8 years, and it was 4 years was good there, and then next year we kind of repeated it.
Yep.
Every time 4 years was the sweet spot. The one, 4-year-old one from the previous year was not. It kind of just went south a little bit, started outside like that one.
And not every year is brewed. It tastes exactly the same just by itself. It was fresh, right? So, yeah, exactly. So you're gonna have a good year and a bad year, and then it's kind of a balance of like, well, which was the good year, and then it was good and it also aged well. Like, yeah. So it's kind of tricky, right? But it's interesting. Like the journey is, it's an expensive journey to go on, right? So, so that's kind of tricky. So what I would recommend is make sure you approach it with the right, take the right approach, temperature control, light, all that kind of stuff. One of the key aspects that I've found it's really important is that you track it, right? That you do a FIFO. You don't like, oh, I accidentally grabbed my 2019 when I should have probably grabbed the 2015, right? Keep track of it, like whether it's pen and paper or I listed a couple of apps here on the slide here. One's Cellar HQ and the other one's the Beer Cellar. I personally use Beer Cellar because what I like about Beer Cellar is it has a cellar. You add your beer there, and it's got a database, so usually you can find your beer, and it says vintage and size and all that kind of stuff, and you can tell it's 22-ounce bomber or 12-ounce beer, glass can, right? And then once it's in your cellar, you can move it to the fridge. Like you can have a fridge, a cellar, you can have different locations, right? So if you have a closet, a cellar, a wine fridge, whatever, you can move it around, and then you can consume it, and when you consume it, you can actually make notes. So when you're doing a vertical, or when you buy like a case of a particular beer and you're tasting one every year, then you can go back and say, well, how did it taste last year? I don't remember because it's been a year, right? You have that cataloged in your diary basically that you know, okay.
Crowdsourced information with it. 'Cause I use Cellar Tracker for wine.
Okay,
And
very similar, yeah.
And you pull up the wine, you're like, oh, I've got this that's been around for 5 years. Do I need to drink it? And you get everybody else's like ratings.
Yeah, it's like a window.
There's probably a way. There's probably a way to do that on the Beer Cellar.
Okay.
I haven't like explored that aspect of it, but check. There's a couple of them, and I found that Cellar IQ and the Beer Cellar are the ones that have been around for long enough so they're not vaporware. So, but again, you could also have a pen and paper and write in it. There are a lot of forums on Facebook and other that talk about like aging beer and cellaring beer, and so if you're questioning about a particular vintage or whatever, you can actually go on there and you get like feedback, right?
I like Cellar Tracker because it actually will tell you if you track your wine.
Yeah.
It'll alert you and say this wine's coming up. Like you
Okay.
need to drink this in the next year or so.
Nice.
Like everybody's kind of rated here, and if you go too far in that vintage, it's
That's great. That's great.
right.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Goes well with lamb. So, that's actually a great, and I think that that brings up a good point. Is that back to the original point of this whole thing? Is not a lot of people think about beer and aging and cellaring, but they always think about wine, right? Everybody always thinks about, oh, I want to let this sit down for another 10 years or whatever, right? They don't think about beer like that. And I got to say, beer, there are some beers that actually age very gracefully at 10, 20, even 30 years. Thomas Hardy's ale, which went out of production, came back in production, went out of production, came back in production, is now being produced again by an Italian outfit. There's folks that have drank that beer like a 1976 Thomas Hardy ale, and it ages amazingly gracefully. Now you got to be careful. You don't want to hot, cold, shock, and all that kind of stuff. You want to cellar it properly, but there are beers that will age just as gracefully as wine. Okay. Hair of the dog, for example. There may or may not be one.
2020 shot top, yeah. Blue Moon, delicious.
There may or may not be. So now we're going to start talking about some of the tasting and kind of what happens to the beer as it ages, and then the next slide we'll talk about like the details of what impacts from each component of beer get into, right? So first off is generally from the alcohol content and the harsher flavors, you'll find that as you age a beer, it'll soften those harsh edges. So if you've tasted the beer and you're like, wow, this is really too roasty or really too boozy, if you age that, it'll soften those sharp edges a little bit, okay?
It'll smooth it.
It'll smoothen it, yeah, to use Ralph's favorite term. And there's some homogenization, right? Like sometimes you taste a beer and it's like very like everything's too separate. I've got all this roast over here. I got this raisin and prune, and it's just like all like too much noise. When you age it, it'll actually kind of homogenize a little bit, right? And some flavors will fade. For example, Dogfish 120, right? You guys are tasting this. All the hops have dropped out. The hops fade fast, right? Hops really fade fast. And it has this kind of sweetness, and that booze is still really present. But it was always sweet. Like if you've drinking one of these fresh, it doesn't seem sweet. But this beer was just always sweet, but now that the bitterness and the hops have dropped out, now it tastes a lot sweeter than you think it was. But it's always the sweet. The sweetness didn't change.
A lot of the high alpha hops turn more tea-like over time, so it's like citrus. No matter what you pick, it'll be more tea.
Yeah, and it can get really weird too. You got to be careful with anything with high alpha hops because they'll get really weird over time. They can get hay and
like
grass and some unpleasant.
Like
Exactly.
Golding is more of a
Exactly. Ralph, you're jumping ahead again. So oxidation plays a role, right? It plays a role, and that actually can have a really beneficial effect on certain malts and certain characteristics of that beer, right? So you can take a really super roasty beer or something that's really boozy, and with a little bit of oxidation and time, it turns into like leather and sherry and all these kind of really cool flavors, right? Like that's what I'm getting a lot on this Dogfish. I'm getting sherry like crazy. Like this is sherry. Like this, I want to cook with this. Exactly. Caglione. So let's talk about this slide has a lot of detail, and I'm gonna refer to my notes because there's so much here, and I'm gonna go through it relatively quick because I know I don't want to be too time constrained here. But it's just interesting, and I'll provide all this information for you guys to talk about later. But roasted malts, the high roasted malts have an antioxidative property, and they have a slow aging effect on the flavor of the beer. The darker the malts, they can create the sherry and port flavors like we were just talking about, and specifically amber cola malts can turn into those sherry notes, and maybe even develop into that chocolatey character over time. Wheat generally does not age well. It gets kind of waxy and meaty. But some beers, like when you have a microbe or a Belgian, the yeast kind of balance that out and it consumes some of that, the weird off flavors that wheat can produce over time. So a Brett beer or something with microbes or even a Belgian yeast will actually develop and take that and make it something pretty magical. High ABV beers like wheat wines, barrel-aged wheat wines, Doppelbock Weissens like Aventinus. Aventinus is really interesting. Like at year one, you kind of get these, where's my notes here? Yeah, Aventinus is a Doppelbock Weissen. It's like a 8-9% wheat beer, right? It's got a little chocolate in there, but year one, you get a lot of the esters and you get a lot of the booziness, but then year four, it's like vanilla and ice creamy, and it gets kind of really interesting as you age that one. And that's like 60% wheat bill, right? So that it kind of gets outside of that rule against having wheat. So the yeasty flavors in the Belgian beers can develop into like the vanilla and leather and tobacco and some of those characteristics when you get into that aging process, right? So, and it's really kind of interesting. Like some of these yeasty characters can really get really amazing. I had a 2010 Fantôme, which I believe that's the one in the picture, at a restaurant in New York, and it was like brie. It tasted like brie, which normally in a beer you would think was off-putting and like a flaw. This was just fantastic, and it paired with the food perfectly. It was amazing. So acidity can slowly mellow over time. It can lead to more complex and delicate beer flavors. The wild yeast Brett beers and some of the wild micro beers, they'll continue to ferment over time. And so sometimes you have to be a little bit careful, and you got to be tasting those ones as they age a little bit to make sure that they're not going into a weird direction. But they also dry the beer out because it continues to ferment, so it's going to have more of a champagne-like character over time. Again, the body of the beer will thin out over time, so it's not going to have a lot of that perceived thickness. So again, it goes back to like just, you can't fix a beer by aging it. If you have a Russian Imperial Stout or a Porter or something that you don't think has enough body, well, if you age it, it's not going to get more body. It's not going to miraculously come up with more body. It's actually going to get thinner over time because, like we talked about before with Mark's comment, when you stand that bottle up, a lot of the proteins and everything drop out of the solution, right? Hoppiness and bitterness fades relatively quickly. Some of the higher beta acid hops, like Ralph was talking about earlier, EKG, Palisades, Hallertau, Mittelfrüh, these will actually have an interesting characteristic over time. Like over time, they can kind of have this subtle fruitiness to them. Alpha acids do the opposite. They either disappear altogether or they can have some weird off flavors. That's why you try to stay away from high alpha acid hop beers. One that's interesting is when you have a wood-aged beer, the oak or the wood really stays present in there. It can kind of fade and homogenize over time, but you will see it. You might notice a more pronounced wood character because of the fact that it stays present. Everything else is dropping out. Again, like when the hops fade, it tastes more sweet. When all the other stuff in the beer fades, the bourbon, the vanilla, the whatever else is in there, that wood comes forth more, and you get more of the wood as that beer ages. Okay. So fruit and spices, again, they drop out, they fade. Some of them can kind of evolve a little bit, but when you're getting a fruit character like fig and prunes and some of the really dried fruit and the sweeter notes, that's really the malt evolving. It's not any of the fruit that was actually put into the beer. Okay. Phenols and esters evolve. You can kind of they go from like peppery to kind of vanilla character and the sherry stuff relatively quickly. So I really like when you have a beer that is very super complex to pair with food. So as these beers age, you get more character. You get a very wine-like aging character, and so pairing those with foods is important to. Back to like get 6 of them and age them over time and figure out where the sweet spot is. That's when you want to pull out the lamb and serve it with that, 2012 Russian Imperial Stout, right? So speaking of stouts, I'm going to pull out a 2017 Imperial Stout brewed with chocolate and coffee, aged in maple syrup bourbon barrels. This is Founders, and it's their Canadian breakfast stout. So I've been holding on to this one for a while. I do have a vertical, but I just figured I'd bring the oldest one that I had and share it with y'all.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
Wow.
Cellared properly.
Might not have been that nice.
What's that?
I said I might not have been that nice. Might.
So the first thing I notice about this one is it still has some decent carbonation. Oh. So let's talk about the don'ts, because we talked about a lot of some of the do's, right? Let's talk about don'ts. First of all, don't age high alpha hop acid beers. Okay. It gets weird. You can try and try and try. It still stays weird. The thing about the Dogfish 120 is, and maybe you can speak to this with the verticals that you have. I've done a vertical before of 120. And some of them get really weird because there is some high alpha acids in there. They get really sweet and cloying, and some of them can get kind of weird in an awful kind of way. So it kind of breaks the rules because it's so high in alcohol and there's so many other characteristics that make it an ageable beer. And they recommend it, so they've kind of designed a little bit of aging capability into that beer. Don't exclude the drier styles like the Trappist triples and some of the Trappist doubles, right? Some of those beers actually age relatively well. So it's going to lose some of the body, but that's something that's that don't worry about it. Don't overage. Don't think you're just going to stick that beer in the back of a closet and it's going to sit for 12, 20, whatever years and it's going to taste good, right? Cellaring beer, you've got to commit, you've got to understand the styles, you got to understand the aging process, and you got to test and taste, okay? Don't rush your wild and Brett beers. What's interesting about wild and Brett beers is it's always a living product, right? It's always going to continue to ferment, and you might go through some weirdness in the Brett beer. It might get weird. It might get, what's it when they call it sick beer? What's that, ropey? It can go through these weird phases where so if you don't like it, let it sit a while longer and it could improve.
This is a little spicy, a little peppery.
What, this one? Yeah.
It's got the wood, it's got the sweetness, it's got the coffee.
Yeah, I get a lot of coffee. It is thin.
Aged beers thin out?
Yes, they thin out. Yep, absolutely. That's what we were talking about earlier. Like, don't think you're gonna fix a beer. If you brew an imperial stout that's too thin, don't think you're gonna fix it by aging it. It's gonna get even thinner, right? Beers will thin out over time. So chocolate, maple syrup. So, what are you guys getting on this one?
I'm starting to pick up the tinge of food, which is typical for aged darker beers.
Yep.
That are typically higher alcohol.
Yep.
They tend to go towards fruit.
And I get like you pick up a lot more of the residual sweetness too because all the other stuff is kind of dropping out. But I still get the coffee and the chocolate.
Coffee, chocolate, bourbon is still present.
Yep. And yeah, exactly. This is a dessert beer.
I get some of the maple sweetness in those.
Hmm? I get a lot of coffee in the flavor still. Like really like blended in, not like distinct. Okay. I got you. Good beer?
I get smooth.
Yeah? Not too shabby?
Definitely something that's changed over time.
So more, yeah, nice. More do not overlook high beta alpha hops that we talked about earlier. Don't assume anything. Don't make any assumptions. Test, taste, test, taste. Also get feedback, but only you know what you like. Like, not everybody's gonna like this beer, you know? That vegetal might put Jason way over the edge and he's like, I can't do this, this sucks, I can't, it's like my blind spot, right? Whereas, dude, I got coffee and sweetness here, I'll pour this on pancakes. I don't care. I love this thing, right? Nice. And don't overlook the sours and the smoke beers. Like Ralph was talking about earlier, a Berliner Weiss, which is kind of violates the 7% rule typically, right? But some of those can go for a year or two and actually get interesting and improve. Once you go beyond that, typically they start to fall off more quickly, the lighter beers, but don't overlook those. And so let's talk about designing a beer, right? Like, what are our design considerations if we want to brew a beer to age it, or that we want something that's going to stand up to some age? First of all, you want to look at hops that are higher in beta acids, okay? And these hops are, and you can look at the beta and alpha ratios, right? A 1-to-1 is ideal, but a higher beta to alpha is even better. EKG is a great hop, readily available. Palisades, Middlefew, Willamette. There's a bunch of different hops that are really good in that beta range that can still give you some hop complexity when you drink the beer fresh and some bitterness, but they'll also evolve and age over time and not mess the beer up, okay? Complexity in your grain bill. Think about what you're tasting here. This is a lot of adjuncts that are still remaining around, but what do you want that beer to look like? Do you want to get more of the sherry note? Do you want to get more of the fruity note, like the prunes and that ripe fruit? Well, look at some of the crystal malts. Crystal malts can kind of give you some of that, or darker roasted malt, or even like a highly roasted wheat malt, like a chocolate wheat. Maybe that's going to give you something interesting, right? But make it more complex, because the more complexity you have, the more those flavors can homogenize and evolve over time, okay? Obviously, you want to target 7 ABV. You want to think about your adjuncts. If you're going to use adjuncts when the beer is fresh, those are not going to necessarily age very well, or they're not going to be present long-term in the beer. You want to pick adjuncts like maple barrel or some other adjuncts that actually will stay around. Wood tends to stay around, and certain adjuncts will stick around in the beer. And then you got to think about, do you want a can or a bottle? Can has advantages because it seals against any oxygenation. It's still, the jury's still out on aging in cans. How did that talking backwards hold up? Did you guys taste that one?
Really good.
Yeah?
I like the
Does it still taste like a triple?
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting. That beer is it stands up pretty well. Could be the can, right? So it's not going to evolve over time. Maybe the can keeps it fresher. The jury's still out on aging in cans because we don't know, because the can is mostly plastic. It's got a little bit of aluminum, but the cans are mostly plastic, right? And how does the acidity of the beer hold up over time? Is it going to degrade the actual container? Glass, a little bit more stable, it's more inert, right? So again.
So on cans, I would say it depends on how good the canner is. But I've had a bunch of crowlers that leak.
Oh.
Horribly oxidized.
Yeah. Crowlers are terrible.
So cans, crowlers, I mean, the surface area is larger on a crowler than on a can.
It's the worst trick perpetuated on beer drinkers across the planet. Crowlers are terrible. Yeah. 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 And
Some of that other stuff plays in there.
yeah, exactly.
Keeps the light out.
Keeps the light out, exactly. So it's a great. So I'm not saying it's not a good idea to have cans. I'm just saying I don't have a lot of experience. I've got some cans now in my cellar that I'm trying out to see how it if it evolves. Because if it doesn't evolve, like what's the point of even aging it, right? I want.
It ages well, but it doesn't change that much. You can get it, and it comes out painful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Oscar Blues.
It tastes great, and they have a barrel aged version they can.
Yep.
But it doesn't change like Dogfish does, like
Yeah.
some of the bottled beers. It's light. Maybe. Right? It's light.
And it's more sealed. There's like caps. Even though caps are sealed, it's still you can still get oxygen through a cap, right?
So I'm keeping it painless. I've been collecting painless the last few times.
Yeah.
Painless, so I've got a vertical 4-pack of painless sitting around.
If I said I had the first bottling of Painless in my cellar, I wouldn't be lying. 2016. I got a Painless from 2016 in the cellar. Yeah, the first bottling when they bottled instead of can. So waiting for a special event on that one. So cap versus cork, again, the same thing. Oxygenation. Do you want more oxygen? Do you want to have that benefit? You know, oxygen can do some really cool things to beers that have high alcohol and a lot of dark roasted malts. You get that. I love this kind of leathery tobacco, that kind of exposure. So I like a keg, like when you have a corked bottle, right? But not every beer is going to hold up to that. So when you're designing your beer, how do you want to package it? Do you want to have a cork, or do you want to have, you know, corks aren't going to hold up to long-term aging as much as a cap. And then you got Cantillon. Cantillon does a cork and a cap. So there you go.
How about wax? How does wax hold up?
That's the last one on my list, right? So, but then bottle. Before we get to the wax question, Bottle conditioning is also important. Do you want to bottle condition? Do you want it to evolve over time? Do you want to have those benefits of some of the residual yeast to kind of turn those flavors that you want? So again, these are all the decisions that you have to make when you design a beer, and it goes back to the first slide that we talked about. Well, what's your goal? Like, until you know what your goal is to determine what your goal is. And so if your goal is to have that really evolution of those yeasty characters, then yeah, let's do bottle conditioning. Do bottle conditioned beer. If not, then don't bottle condition, right? Keg condition and put it in a bottle. Or a can. Yeah. It's tricky, right? Because then you over-rotate it on your sugar addition, and then you have a bottle bomb, and then what's a bottle bomb look like after you've aged it for 8 years? That's an interesting test to run. Yeah. So, and then to wax or not to wax. This is something we can debate. There's a lot of topics in homebrewing and brewing in general that are very debatable across the board. What do you guys think? What do you think about wax? Waxing the top of the bottle, like putting a wax coating on the bottle. You see these in some of these.
The point of corks is to let it read very, very slowly, right? And if you wax it, that's not happening. So you might as well cap.
You don't normally see wax and a cork. You'll see a cap with a wax. So normally you don't see that, the combo. So yeah, so wax in theory is going to seal it better to let less oxygen in there. So if you don't want those oxidative flavors, then you do the wax. But I gotta say, like, a wax bottle looks pretty freaking cool, right? Like, so there's some of that cool factor.
Marketing, like Maker's Mark. That's why.
Yeah, like Maker's Mark has, like, but to do it, that's why Ocelot stopped doing it. It's a pain in the ass. And not only is it a pain in the ass to actually package, it's a pain in the ass to open, man. You need like a degree in differential calculus to open up a bottle that has a freaking wax dip. So.
The real question here is wax on, wax off.
Exactly.
I would say you have to wax a Brazilian beer.
Yeah. But bunch. That's why I went to wax or not to wax. That is the question. So I've got more beers. That's the end of the talking discussion. I'd love to have more interaction and discussion and Q&A, but I also have a lot of beers to drink. And so the first one that I have to pull out, this is a beer from Hair of the Dog. This beer was designed by this brewery at an annual release. They designed this beer to age. The style is actually Adam beer, which is why it's called Adam. It's a distinct historical style that's even fallen out of the VJCP guides. This is batch number 26, which was brewed and bottled in 1997.
Whoa.
Yes.
What?
Wow.
So, there's only one 12-ounce bottle left on the planet. So let's taste, but don't take too much. Take a little bit and share, and I'll open and pass it up. Yeah.
What is Adam beer?
Adam beer it's kind of like an old ale style. It's a stock ale. It's like it's got some maltiness to it and hoppiness. It's an interesting style.
See how it's interesting?
It's hard to describe. It's extinct. It's like the duck-billed platinum. So now I'm gonna pour this because what I found with these older beers is there's a lot of sediment. So I want to do it almost like a continuous pour, so we don't have to bring it all the way back up vertical.
Let's get
Okay.
the bread line.
So are you even 27 years old? Like this beer might be older than you. Like.
I'll take that at the time.
Nice.
Wow.
So this is really interesting.
How old is it?
Yeah. It's 1997.
Damn.
It's almost as old as my marriage.
Yeah.
It's old.
So this is Hair of the Dog. It's an Adam beer, batch number 26. They designed this beer specifically for aging, and so this is the last one on the planet. Yeah.
Yeah.
97 was a really good year for me. So.
It's as old as my son.
You were.
Yeah.
I was like,
It's 97.
it could have only
Yeah.
gotten worse. You did the right
Cheers
thing.
to your son.
It is fantastic. So I get a lot of.
I was horrified.
I'm getting like tobacco-y too. Like, are you guys getting any tobacco? Like, in a good way. Like,
Yeah,
Not-
like before you smoke it.
not like lick an ashtray. Yeah, but like, yeah.
Chewing tobacco.
Yeah, yeah.
Like Turkish tobacco. This is gonna get bad. So luckily,
Did you ever smell a camel? Like a camel cigarette? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Unfiltered Camel.
unfiltered camel.
Yes.
Boom.
Got you. Got you.
That, that sweet, sticky.
But there's not a lot of aroma though. I'm not getting a lot of aroma like this.
No, I get
What's that?
So I get a lot of prune on the nose.
Yeah, yeah, cigar. Yeah, absolutely.
I get a little.
Chewing on cigar, not smoking it though, right? Like, yeah.
Thanks for letting me try it. Cheers, man. Thank you very much.
Glad we could share.
Cheers. Keep hanging out. Stop by my bar if you want a beer. It's on the house. Whoever comes up.
We also have an 05 that we're gonna crack open here.
Really?
2005.
I'll check in the bar and then I'll kind of.
Yeah.
That stuff can get clean later.
We've got what?
No doubt about that. 10:30. Right?
Obviously, there's zero carbonation.
We've got some.
Yeah, we got a 2017. This is our vintage age cellaring beer presentation. So we got a lot of old beer. Got a lot of old beer.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Is that a thing?
There's a lot
Yeah,
of
actually it is.
Then I will.
I'll have some of that too. Yeah, please.
You should get a
So the sad part about this beer, okay?
I don't mind just a little sip, but you're right. I could.
The sad part about this beer is Hair of the Dog has been open for 30 years. And they just closed, and it wasn't for a bad reason like Anchor. They closed because the owner decided that he wanted to retire and he didn't have any little bambinos to pass on the business to, so they just decided to close.
Get in the can. Set this back down for you guys.
What's that?
Isn't that what happened to golf?
I'm saying you can find our YouTube channel from there.
Because
No, they merged. They merged with another similar sized guys, yeah.
We only got like 3 or 4 talks. It's a new thing. Right, so.
Joe, what year was that? Was the Fred?
That Fred was 99 that we had.
So similar.
Yeah. But that night, that poker night, we had this one and the Fred.
Okay.
There you go.
Feed in on one.
11.7. I got.
You're doing the,
Tastes like.
yeah. 2017, yeah, right? Really sweet, right? Yeah. Coffee, bourbon barrel, yeah. Okay, so let's do the two. So now, 2005, we got a little bit more. This is the same brewery. They brew a lot of these annual vintage beers to age. This is a 2005 barley wine. They call it Doggy Claws. I don't know why they call it Doggy Claws. I know why they call it Adam, because like one of the brewers' like close relatives named Adam, and he passed away, and he started brewing it because he liked this type of beer. Blah blah blah. So Doggy Claws. I don't know why. I don't know if I want to know, but. And this one I got.
That's for sure.
This one I got specifically because I was married in 2005, so this is the year of my marriage. So this beer is as old as my marriage.
We got like a 5-year-old beer here. 'Cause then I can say it's a little.
2005.
2005. So what? How many years is that?
That is one of the things that
18?
fixes over time.
It's older than my son.
Thank you, sir. one day I'll pay for your pop. Older than my sons. Both of them. Twins. Thanks.
We got some? Smug of me got him.
Okay. 25 years later.
Oh shit. You may get some sediment, dude.
Yeah, it's like an
We did it in the wrong order.
Yeah, we got some. Here, I'll crack another one.
Everybody in this cup.
This one is sweet and then very bitter.
A little leather.
Back end.
This tastes like hoisin sauce.
Oh, it does. It tastes like it. You're right. It tastes like hoisin. Dude, totally. Which can
Put this in my pho. Like.
which can happen like
Oh yeah.
meaty umami, like yeah, there's that whole yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's a totally good call. I'm surprised I'm still getting some foam here.
Yeah, that's impressive.
It's easily aroused, though, Joe. That's what we need to know.
It is easily aroused.
The residual in there is fantastic.
Oh yeah, the yeasty part. Do you guys want to do another one of this one? Because I got 2 of them.
Dump the bottom.
You go 5?
I think we have enough down there. I mean, you got a few more in there.
Yeah. Let's go to comp beers because all I have.